Right, there it is. All right. So, hi, my name is Andre Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us for these trainings. We'll be doing a lot of online sessions, and so we hope you sign up either as a group or organization. You also can do it as an individual. Each of our trainings will come with their own PDF and assignments, so we'll make sure that we can keep people engaged and in these trainings. So a little bit about me. I am the Program Director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Mayo Clinic. I'm also a trainer and consultant outside of that work, and so that's primarily where this work comes out of. And so I'll be presenting a lot of ideas and concepts and information that I hope that you will be able to use in your own organization. So without further ado, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of unconscious bias or implicit bias in cognitive control. So first of all, there is a difference between unconscious bias and implicit bias, right? So unconscious bias is that stuff that we're not aware of. Implicit bias is that stuff that we're not aware of that has gotten into the systems in our organizations, in our processes, and how we think about making decisions, right? So from an organizational standpoint. So unconscious bias is very individual, where implicit bias is that individual bias that is now baked into our system, right? So a couple of examples would be like, how do we make decisions about who gets hired and who doesn't, right? Addressing that the conversation around diversity versus high standards, right? So even in that having that conversation, there is some implicit bias happening just in that conversation. So we'll address those kinds of things, and ultimately this cognitive control, right? So whether I have blind spots or not, whether they're baked into a system, baked or individual, I ultimately, as a sentient being, will be held accountable for that. We'll be responsible for that. And so we'll talk about this idea of cognitive control. So how do you take cognitive control, and what does that mean to have cognitive control? So we'll start there. One of the first things that we need to recognize is that we all come from a context, and that context is an attempt for us to get some of our basic needs met. Right? And so when we think about our identities, there are multiple dimensions to our identities. There are multiple ways in which we seek value or try to gain these things. And so the three primary things that people are after comes out of the work of Alfred Adler in Adlerian psychology. And so what Adler offers us is this idea that we're after three things. And so Abraham Maslow kind of built off of these Adlerian ideas and came up with what we typically refer to as the hierarchy of needs. But if we boil those hierarchy of needs, they come down to three things: that we're all looking for significance, we're all looking for belonging, and we're all looking for safety. And significance suggests that I am a person with purpose and power, that my being here on the planet is not an accident, and whether I decide what that purpose is, or the heavens open up and they express to me what my purpose is. Either way, we're all looking for our purpose, right? How do we serve? How do we engage? And secondly, we want to be in relationships with people who understand our purpose. We want to be in relationships. And I would say that for me, maybe it's not true for you, but for me, oftentimes the people who have understood my purpose were not the people I was born to. Right? There weren't the communities or the people. There were people that I selected that understood my value. And so oftentimes we have to look for that sense of belonging, even if it doesn't come from the families that we've been grafted into or birthed into. Right? And then lastly, we're looking for safety. We're looking for physical, mental, emotional. I mean, really the all-encompassing concept of concept of psychological safety, right? So we're looking for how we can be physically, mentally, and spiritually safe to be in relationships with people who understand our purpose, right? And so typically when I'm doing this workshop in person, what I'll do is I'll go to this this picture here with the 5 green circles, and I'll have people put down one thing that they value in each of those circles. Not paying attention to the larger circle yet, but we'll get to that in just a second. So what I'd like for you to do, wherever you are, and if you have the PDF, certainly use that. If not, go ahead and draw 5 circles on a piece of paper and humor me, because this will actually be helpful to you, right? And so what I'd like for you to do is to put 5 things that you value or that are important to you. They could be concepts, they could be people, they could be things, they could be places, right? So 5 things that you value. All right. Now, when we're in a classroom setting, what I ask people to do, and we actually may add a Slido to this presentation so you can do this live and in person with your group, is find commonalities, right? So find someone to sign on one of those values, and they are to sign on it if they agree, if they like what they see on your paper, or if they have something similar. Right? They sign in either case. So they'll put their signature or their initials in each of those circles. And typically when we do this in a classroom setting, and you'll see this also on the online portion of this, is that we oftentimes do have commonalities. They may be expressed differently, we may use different words, they may have a different context, but for the most part, we share a lot of commonalities. And so when we think about diversity, what I want us to think about is that diversity is the recognition of our commonalities and our differences simultaneously at the same time, right? So it is our commonalities and our differences that we're recognizing, that we're honoring, that we're respecting when we talk about diversity. All right. So moving on. So actually, I'm going to go back. So when we talk about those 5 circles, so we go around those talk about those 5 things that we value, that we think are important. We also spend time in this particular section addressing the types of values that we had. And so there'll be a Slido piece to this that I'll have you put some of those into the Slido, and we'll see what the commonalities are, right? But more importantly than that, I want to spend some time thinking about what's not in those circles. What are the things that are not in those circles? So typically I'll ask a group, did anyone put in their 5 circles this concept of race, right? Their race or their ethnicity. Does that show up in those circles? And more often than not, the answer is no, that it doesn't show up. And so then I ask, what about your gender identity, your gender, your sexual orientation? Does that show up in those five circles? And again, people typically in a classroom setting, the majority of people say no. There are those who say yes, but the majority of people say no. And then the last question I ask about this is, out of those things that we've written down, how much of that is an indication, it is an indication of our social economic status, right? Which of those, did you write down your social economic status? Well, I'm middle class, or I'm lower class, or I'm upper. Did you write that in? Okay, so why is it that people didn't typically in groups don't put down their race as one of these things that they value or find important, or their gender identity or sexual orientation as one of those primary identities? And why does their social class not necessarily show up in that? What I'm not suggesting is that those things aren't important, because I believe that they are important. However, oftentimes the other things that we wrote down have greater importance than the ones that that could be these kind of social constructs, right? So just think about that as we move forward. Now, those things are important because those are the things that society tries to drive to make us different. But when it comes down to it, there are all these values that we really do share. And so I also want you to think about what of those things, those green circles, were things that solidify your significance, right? What of those things were things that solidify your belonging? And what of those things provide you safety, right? So I want you to kind of think about those as we move forward. We're going to talk a little bit about the triune brain a little bit later. Here in this graphic, you'll see the triune brain and why that red part is so important, why that primal part of our brain, the amygdala, is so important in recognizing how we take control of our unconscious bias or our implicit bias. So moving on. So here's a little process that talks about like this cognitive control, right? So we move from cognitive preparedness, so we prepare ourselves for recognizing and interacting in ways that allow us to be critical in our thinking. And so that moves from cognitive preparedness, cognitive awareness, cognitive dissonance, and that's that gap between two opposing views, right? So being able to hold those in our minds at the same time. And then there's cultural maturity and ultimately cognitive maturity, and then ultimately cognitive control. And we'll come back to that and talk about that and express those, what those mean and how we get to that in a little bit later in this session. So what I'd like for us to kind of think about is this big hairy spider. Now, how many folks, if you can raise your hand during the presentation, hit the button, or on the Slido deck, we'll ask you to kind of participate in this as well, virtually. But how many folks are afraid of, or maybe not even afraid of, but don't particularly care for spiders running around loose? All right, so yeah, so my thing is not so much spiders, or maybe it's snakes for somebody. Is it snakes? Okay. For me, it is mice, and it's not so much the mouse itself, because I had gerbils growing up, I had hamsters, even guinea pigs, right? So it's not the rodent part that gets me, it's the scurrying, it's the little feet, right? That's very unnerving. But what I'd like to express, though, is that if I'm in a meeting, and this is a pretty high-stakes meeting, and I happen to see a spider scurry across the table or a mouse running on the floor, I have choices to make. Now, my initial response, my first emotional response is to jump up on the table and squash the spider, or jump up on the table and try to remove myself as far away from that mouse as possible, right? However, if I'm in this high-stakes meeting, that actually might not be a good option for me. And so what do? I take cognitive control. And I start trying to rationalize. I tell myself particular stories about the mouse or about the spider. I remind myself that I'm bigger than either of those, or that they're more afraid of me than I am. They're more. Yeah, somebody's more afraid, right? So I engage in that mental exercise to prepare myself for dealing with something that I may have either as a blind spot or in some cases even a phobia, right? I have to do this self-talk kinds of things. And the same thing has to happen for us when we talk about implicit or unconscious bias. So we have to kind of navigate that space with some mental discipline, right? So how do we get that? There's a tool that I offer beyond diversity, but we'll get to that at a later part of this presentation. It is important to recognize where you are, so context is important. We're going to kind of go through these a little bit fast because I wanted to get to this before we go ahead and take a break. And so what this is I don't know about you, So I grew up. So I'm getting older now, right? More mature, as people like to say. And back in the day, we went to Olin Mill Studios for our holiday pictures. I don't know if anyone knows or recognizes that thing. So it was kind of like J.C. Penney's studio for taking pictures. So this was before you could just take them with your phone or even hire a photographer. You had to go as a family to these studios. And so I recall one time I'm at the studio with my family, and we take the family photo, and we had to wait to get the photo back from the developer. So they sent this photo off and brought it back. And so one of the things I would do, I don't know about you, but whenever those family photos came back, who was the first person you looked for? Who did you try to find when those pictures came? And for me, the first person I was looking for was myself. It's not so much that I was narcissistic, but more about, I wanted to see if my impression of myself was the same as what comes across in the photo, right? So I wanted to see, I thought I looked good, but do I really look good, right? And fortunately, it was true. I did look good. I looked good in both cases, but that's beside the point. And so I wonder sometimes. I fascinate on what would happen if I got the picture back and I wasn't there. Like I was either blurred out or smudged out in some way. What would I think about that? And so I want you to think about that, right? So you go take these family photos, and in the first year you don't show up. What do you say about that process? What do you say about the photographer? What do you say about the process? Most of us would say that there was some kind of technical difficulty that didn't allow me to show up in that picture, right? There was some mistake that was made. But what if this happens for the next 5 years? You go to take this family photo, you know you're there, the family knows you're there, but you just don't show up either clearly or at all in the picture. What do you then start to say? You might start to think that there's a conspiracy, right? You may even take it upon yourself that, I don't take good pictures. And so, you go to other events and people try to take your picture. And because you haven't shown up well in these pictures, you now say to these people, don't take my picture because I don't take good pictures. I don't take good pictures. So you took something that could have been a systemic thing, and because you did not show up in the picture, now you're saying that it's me. It's not systemic. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Preamble to the Constitution of the United States. And so when we think about this all men are created equal, what typically happens is we start to recognize that there are people not in the picture. There are people not in the picture. And so part of our responsibility is to, as you see on the screen here, there are people who have been blotted out of the picture. And so when we think about our great Constitution, when we think about the preamble, who was left out of those things, right? All men are created equal. We do know contextually that the language of all men was the shortcut, the shorthand, if you will, for all humans. So we know that. But in terms of how it practically plays out, is that necessarily equal, right? And so what groups are not a part of that? What groups, in all practicality, don't play into these great sacred documents? Because as the ink is drying on the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, we're also engaged in some pretty interesting practices. One of those being the transatlantic slave trade, right? So how can we search for this freedom simultaneously holding people in this economic system of chattel slavery? Yeah, how do we do that, right? How do we not let women participate in the system that we say is a free and fair system that's based on merit? We're going to base it on merit. So when we think about those things, the thing that we need to be reminded of is that this is where kind of social justice comes in, right? So, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and securing of blessings to ourselves and our posterity. We do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America, right? And so when those things are there, so social justice really becomes this place where we make sure that everybody is back in the picture. It's not some Marxist, leftist, or even right wing, whatever. It really is about making sure that the promises of our sacred documents are manifest for all of its citizens, right? For all of its citizens. So we'll move on from there a little bit more, and I want to talk a little bit about what are some of so we talked about this idea of safety, significance, and belonging. We've talked about social justice is really about who's missing in the picture. So how do we create that playing field where everyone can participate? And now I just want to spend a little time talking about some truths of human motivation, right? So safety, significance, and belonging are our goals, but there are some ways in which we interact with the world that we have to understand, and as we move into conversations about implicit bias and cognitive control. And so first of all, one of the truths is that human beings can learn, change, and grow. So many of us wouldn't be engaging in this particular training. We wouldn't be engaging in our careers if we did not believe this. If this wasn't a tenet of our belief system, we wouldn't be where we are today. And so, pardon me. So it wouldn't be a part of our belief system today. And so human beings can learn, change, and grow. What we also have to recognize is that it may not be on my time frame, right? So their learning, their changing, their growing has little to do with my time frame. When do seeds come up? When they're ready to come up. And we're going to stop right there. We're going to take a pause. We'll take a pause right here.